Why do the most powerful people seem to make less effort than everyone else? Have you noticed how truly influential individuals respond to provocations? They don't get agitated, don't explain their positions defensively, don't try to prove anything. There's a calmness in them that confuses aggressors, because it goes against everything we expect from someone being attacked. This apparent passivity hides something most people don't understand. When you react emotionally to a provocation, you transfer your power to whoever provoked you. Your energy, your attention, your emotional stability now depend on another person's actions. You've entered a game where you don't control the rules. Lao Tzu observed this in ancient China when studying how leaders maintained authority during times of political turbulence. In the Tao King, he described a principle he called wei, often translated as non-action, but meaning something more subtle, action without unnecessary resistance, like water that flows around obstacles instead of trying to break them. He realized that true strength doesn't directly oppose opposing force. Instead, it flows around resistance, finding the path of least friction to reach its goal. When someone tries to provoke you, they're offering resistance, expecting you to push back. When you don't offer that resistance, they have nowhere to apply their force. This creates a disconcerting dynamic for the aggressor. Their strategy depends on throwing you off balance, but you remain centered. The more they escalate aggression, the more obvious it becomes that you're not participating in their emotional game. This energy difference becomes visible to everyone around, but understanding wei is just the foundation. The next step is applying this principle strategically to prevent confrontations before they even form. There's a specific moment in every social interaction where you can determine whether there will be conflict or not. It happens in the first 30 seconds before words are chosen, before positions are declared. It's a moment of mutual assessment where each person unconsciously decides, is this person a threat or an opportunity? Most people completely misread this assessment. They either demonstrate excessive submission, signaling they can be exploited, or project defensive aggression, unnecessarily creating a competitive environment. Both postures generate exactly what you want to avoid: confrontation. Sun Tzu studied this dynamic in military context during the Warring States period in ancient China, but his principles apply perfectly to everyday interactions. In The Art of War, he wrote that supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This happens when you shape circumstances so that resistance becomes illogical. Translating to your relationships. When your presence communicates calm competence and clear boundaries without hostility, you're applying preventive strategy. People feel that confronting you would be more problematic than simply respecting you. Not because you're threatening, but because you seem too centered to be easily unbalanced. Sun Tzu called this winning without drawing the sword. Your authority doesn't come from demonstrations of force, but from the perception that force is available if necessary. It's the difference between a dog that barks constantly and one that watches silently. Which would you take more seriously? This combination, woe as internal foundation and strategic application as external manifestation, creates a presence that naturally discourages testing. But this requires something deeper: absolute control over your own emotional reactions. Imagine someone just interrupted you in an important meeting for the third time. You feel heat rising up your neck, your heart races, and an internal voice starts screaming about disrespect and injustice. In that exact moment, you have a choice that will determine not just the outcome of this situation, but how you'll be treated for months to follow. Most people allow this indignation to take control. They respond with the emotional energy they're feeling: irritation, frustration, or worse, poorly disguised anger. They believe demonstrating these feelings will communicate they shouldn't be disrespected. Actually, they're delivering evidence that they can be easily destabilized. Every time you lose composure, even subtly, you're providing valuable information about how to manipulate you. People around learn which buttons to press to throw you off center. This emotional vulnerability becomes a tool others can use against you whenever they need to put you in a defensive position. Seneca faced exactly this dynamic when serving as advisor to Nero, one of history's most volatile emperors. His survival depended on maintaining mental clarity, while others lost control. In letters to Lucilius and on the brevity of life, he developed a precise system for what he called discipline of impressions, the ability to consciously choose your emotional reactions. He discovered that indignation is a luxury powerful people can't afford. Every moment spent irritated with others' behavior is energy stolen from your own development. More importantly, when you react emotionally, you're allowing other people to control your internal state. The specific technique Seneca practiced involved a mental exercise he did every morning. He visualized possible adversities of the day, criticism, disrespect, obstacles, and mentally rehearsed serene responses to each situation. When these situations actually happened, his mind had already processed them. He wouldn't be caught off guard or pushed out of center. The result was emotional stability that confused aggressors. The more they tried to provoke reactions, the more obvious became the difference between his control and their lack of control. This disparity created a natural hierarchy, where Seneca automatically assumed the position of authority. But developing internal control is only half the equation. The other half is understanding how the world really works and navigating this reality without naivety. There's an unwritten rule governing all social interactions, but nobody taught you in school. People constantly evaluate whether you're someone who imposes consequences or someone who simply accepts any treatment. This evaluation happens unconsciously through micro-signals you send without realizing. The problem is our culture taught you to believe kindness and understanding will always be recognized and rewarded. That if you treat others with respect, you'll automatically receive the same in return. That showing vulnerability creates genuine connection. These beliefs, while noble, make you predictable in a way that can be exploited. Machiavelli observed this dynamic in 15th century Florentine politics, but his insights apply to any social environment. In The Prince, he documented how kind leaders were systematically manipulated for being predictable. He saw upright men losing influence because others knew exactly how they would react to any situation. Machiavelli's most disturbing discovery was that respect isn't earned through moral virtue, but through controlled unpredictability. When people can't predict exactly how you'll react, they automatically treat you with more care. The possibility of consequence, even if never materialized, creates a protective zone around you. This doesn't mean being cruel or dishonest. It means your kindness needs to come accompanied by clear boundaries and willingness to defend them when necessary. Machiavelli realized the difference between respected and exploited people isn't in moral quality, but in the ability to balance compassion with firmness. He developed the concept of respectful fear, a dynamic where others respect you not from fear of aggression, but from recognition that you have standards that won't be flexed to accommodate inappropriate behavior. It's the difference between being feared for being dangerous and being respected for being consistent. When you master this calibration, being cordial but not submissive, being flexible but not undefined, you create a presence that naturally discourages testing. People intuitively feel that trying to exploit your kindness would have costs, so they simply choose not to try. But this strategic posture, combined with solid emotional control, still needs to be refined through social elegance that communicates authority without aggression. Why can certain people command a room without ever seeming to try, while others gesture, speak loudly, interrupt conversations to gain attention? These people simply exist in space differently. When they enter, conversations don't stop abruptly, but the rhythm changes subtly. When they speak, they don't need to compete for attention, because they naturally receive it. Compare this to those who try to impress through obvious performance. They tell exaggerated stories, make forced jokes, constantly mention important names, or demonstrate knowledge ostentatiously. The more effort they make to be noticed, the more obvious it becomes they're insecure about their own relevance. This need for external validation makes them less interesting, not more. The difference isn't in what they do, but in what they don't do. Truly magnetic people have mastered the art of energy economy. They don't waste presence trying to prove value, because they know real value doesn't need to be announced. There's a natural gravity in them that attracts attention without apparent effort. Balthasar Gracian identified this dynamic when serving as a Jesuit in the 17th century Spanish court. He observed how true aristocrats behaved versus those who merely possessed titles. In The Art of Prudence, he documented that authentic authority never explains itself. It simply manifests through consistency and controlled mystery. Gracian realized truly powerful people maintain what he called elegant distance. They don't become too intimate too quickly, don't reveal all their opinions, don't let themselves be completely read. They preserve layers of depth that awaken curiosity and respect. The less predictable you are, the more interesting you become. The specific technique involves 3 elements: Gracian codified economy of words, consistency of actions, and what he called scenario, a quality of self, possession that communicates you don't need anyone's approval to know who you are. When you incorporate these 3 elements, your presence acquires natural weight. This creates a magnetic effect where people want your attention because they feel it has scarce value. You're not trying to win anyone over. So, paradoxically, become more desirable. This psychological inversion is fundamental to authority that can't be contested. But developing this natural elegance is just preparation for understanding a brutal truth about human nature that most prefer to ignore. Have you noticed how some people never seem surprised by betrayal, disappointment, or selfish behavior? When others are shocked by ingratitude from someone they helped, these people simply nod with an expression that says it was expected. They don't become bitter or cynical, but they also don't remain naively hopeful about human nature. This should disturb you. Why aren't they surprised? What do they know about people that you haven't learned yet? The answer is they've understood something fundamental about human motivation that most prefer to ignore. They've seen behind the social mask we all wear and accepted what they found there. Arthur Schopenhauer reached this understanding after years observing human behavior in 19th century Frankfurt in the world as will and representation. He mapped the real impulses that drive human actions versus the rational justifications people offer for those actions. He discovered there's an oceanic distance between the two. Schopenhauer realized most people act primarily from self-interest, but create elaborate narratives about altruism, true love, or moral principles to explain their choices. They're not consciously lying. They genuinely believe their own rationalizations, but the real impulses motivating them remain unconscious and selfish. This discovery initially left him deeply pessimistic about humanity. But over time, he realized accepting this reality protected him from constant disappointments. When you understand people prioritize their own interests above all else, you stop creating unrealistic expectations about loyalty, gratitude, or consideration. The practical result is a mental serenity others interpret as wisdom. You don't get indignant when someone acts selfishly, because that's exactly what you expected. You don't feel betrayed when priorities change, because you understand commitments are always conditional. This acceptance of human nature, as it really is, allows you to navigate relationships without the emotional vulnerability that comes from romantic expectations. But accepting human reality is just preparation for the liberation that comes from stopping the search for external validation. You spend your whole life trying to please people who will never love you the way you need. You collect approval like currency that will one day give you access to some exclusive club where you'll finally feel sufficient. You modify opinions depending on the audience. You hide parts of yourself you imagine are unacceptable. You live in constant anxiety about how you're being perceived and judged. This isn't life. It's perpetual performance, where you're simultaneously actor and audience, but never the director. You've handed control of yourself, esteem to people who have their own problems, their own insecurities, their own psychological games. You're depending on external approval to validate something that can only come from within your own worth. Most devastating is that the more you seek this approval, the less authentic you become. And the less authentic you are, the less interesting you become to people whose approval you so desperately desire. It's a vicious cycle where you become a diluted version of yourself, pursuing something that moves away as you approach it. Friedrich Nietzsche faced exactly this dynamic when breaking with Richard Wagner's intellectual circle in 19th century Germany. For years, He shaped his ideas to fit the group's expectations. But in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he documented his discovery that dependence on external validation is a voluntary prison you can choose to abandon. Nietzsche called this transvaluation of values. The process of radically questioning which opinions really matter to you versus which you simply inherited from your social environment. He realized most people live according to values they've never questioned, pursuing approval from people they don't necessarily respect themselves. Liberation begins when you stop asking what will they think of me, and start asking what do I think of me, not narcissistically, but autonomously. You develop your own criteria for success, your own moral standards, your own definition of a life well lived. You stop outsourcing your self-esteem. This mental independence creates magnetic presence because rarity is always attractive. In a world of people desperate for approval, someone who genuinely doesn't need that validation automatically stands out. Your authenticity becomes a stark contrast to others' constant performance. When you stop trying to please everyone, you paradoxically become more interesting to people who really matter. You attract relationships based on who you are, not who you pretend to be. But this liberation from external approval is just the penultimate step to final transformation, complete integration of who you really are. There's a difference between not caring about others' opinions out of contempt and not caring because you've completely integrated who you are. The first attitude creates defensive isolation. The second creates magnetic authority. Have you met people who radiate such natural confidence that both admirers and critics are drawn to their energy? They don't reject parts of themselves and don't pretend to be others. They don't hide flaws and don't exaggerate virtues. There's a brutal honesty with themselves that translates into authentic presence that's impossible to fake or imitate. This total authenticity creates an energetic frequency that resonates uniquely. Carl Jung discovered this when studying what separated truly fulfilled people from simply successful people during his decades of psychiatric practice in Switzerland. He realized the most magnetic individuals had gone through a process he named individuation, the conscious integration of all personality aspects, including those society considers undesirable. Jung understood most people reject parts of themselves they consider shadowy, primitive, or socially unacceptable. They create a persona, a social mask presenting only characteristics they imagine are admirable. But this internal rejection creates psychological conflict manifesting as insecurity, anxiety, and need for external validation. The individuation process involves recognizing and integrating this rejected shadow, not to become a worse person, but to become a complete person. When you accept your competitive impulses, your capacity for selfishness, your moments of cruelty, your tendency toward manipulation, you stop unconsciously projecting them onto others. This radical self-acceptance generates authority that can't be questioned because it's not based on external approval or idealized self-image. It's based on complete knowledge and integral acceptance of who you really are. People feel this authenticity and respond with automatic respect because they recognize someone who isn't lying to themselves. Jung discovered when you consciously integrate your shadow, it becomes a source of power instead of shame. Your competitiveness becomes healthy ambition. Your selfishness becomes self-respect. Your capacity for cruelty becomes ability to establish boundaries. You access psychological energy you previously wasted repressing. The result is presence that communicates wholeness. You don't need to prove anything because you're not hiding anything. This internal transparency creates external authority that makes confrontations unnecessary because your energy communicates you know exactly who you are and are comfortable with that reality. Now you understand why no one will confront you after this video. Not because you learned intimidation techniques or developed defensive aggression. It's because you built something much more powerful. An integrated presence that naturally discourages testing. When you combine the fluidity of we with Sun Tzu's strategy, add Seneca's emotional control and Machiavelli's realism, refine everything with Gracian's elegance and Schopenhauer's acceptance, liberate yourself from expectations with nature and integrate everything through Jung. You're no longer playing the same game as everyone else. You've transcended the need for confrontation Because you develop something very few people possess: authentic authority. Your energy communicates calm, competence, clear boundaries, and total self-acceptance. People feel this before you even speak. Social predators look for easier targets. Manipulators seek more vulnerable people. Testers find less defended territories. You've become someone who simply isn't worth the effort to confront. Not because you're threatening, but because your presence communicates. Any attempt at destabilization would be more work than simply respecting you. That's the difference between force that needs to be demonstrated and power that's simply recognized. Do you agree with this or think it's weak talk? I want to see your argument in the comments. Now you've seen how these 8 masters can completely transform your social presence. Click the video on screen. You'll discover the specific techniques that make anyone respect you. Click the video on screen now.